first port of call the plant has is nothing got to do with clover or fertilizer or slurry or those sources, to do with the soil. And if you want to grow 13, 14 tons of grass per hectare, which is where we were a few years ago, the soil has to deliver about half the nitrogen required to do that. Right? So the soil must perform. In order for the soil to perform, that means lime, P, K, sulfur, they must all be right.
I've asked John Maher, Programme Manager of Grass10, to join me today to look back at 2024. I also asked John if there were any lessons to be learned from the year and what could be done differently in 2025 to avoid a similar situation.
To use a sporting analogy, we could learn more from defeat than victory. And there's things that happened in 2024 that are going to be very, very relevant going forward. If we were to summarise the year very, very quickly, you'd say nationally it was a very difficult spring. Then things changed in the mid-season. I would say the southern half of the country struggled with grass production. And I would say the northern parts of the country didn't do as bad, and the pasture-based figures support that. And then I suppose you went from one of the worst springs in years to one of the best autumns in years. So that's a quick summary of the year, but the bottom line is that grass production nationally is back by about a ton on a 5-year average, which wasn't hectic in the first place, and a ton and a half or more over a 10-year average. So not the best year, but we have to learn from it. The game has changed, the rules have changed, and change is the order of the day here now going forward.
Yeah, so John, Kieran said the other day to Joe, I'd say a lot of the farms that are still at the top of their game in terms of grass growing are the farms that were top of their game at grass growing a couple of years ago, but their figure is just lower. And there's obviously that policy context around lower levels of fertilizer and so forth. How do we kind of get our heads around this? Is that the case, or in reality, have we just been misfortunate that the reduction in fertilizer has happened to coincide with 2 or 3 very challenging years in terms of grass growth, and we've lost the growth during the main point of when we will help deliver the numbers in terms of that late April, kind of early May, June period where we can grow like a ton of grass easily in the month, or you could lose a ton of grass easily in a month with low growth rates. So is it down to the policy, or is it just, as I said, coincidence that the policy has coincided with the changes? And how does that impact then at farm level?
Well, the reality is it's both, Stuart. Right. Call a spade a spade. We know the fertilizer sales of nitrogen in particular are down a lot compared to 6, 7, 8 years ago. That grows grass, so that's one factor. And the last few seasons haven't been great, and the last 18 months, with the exception of the autumn 2024, have been some of the poorest for years. So it's both, right? But the environment we're moving into now has changed, and the rules have changed. So, the nitrogen allowances going forward are only going to go in one direction. We now turn from being, a system that gave us flexibility on fertilizer and nitrogen application, to a system now that's more regulated, more monitored, and the allowances are tighter. And we're into what I would call a more moderate nitrogen fertilizer input regime. And if you talk to our colleagues in France, Stuart, and the people that we deal with from in around that brings more risk. The other thing that they would argue quite strongly is that we have to get a better understanding of nitrogen in our systems and where it comes from to grow grass. And people will say that, there are challenges with fertilizer, challenges with clover, and other sources of nitrogen. But the first port of call, right, the plant has is nothing got to do with clover or fertilizer or slurry or those sources, to do with the soil. And if you want to grow 13, 14 tons of grass per hectare, which is where we were a few years ago, the soil has to deliver about half the nitrogen required to do that, right? So the soil must perform. In order for the soil to perform, that means lime, P, K, sulfur, they must all be right. And that's the first port of call for the plant. And if that's compromised and it In 2024, particularly in the southern part of the country, that was badly compromised. We know from the research done in Moore Park, it's just one site and a very dry site and fertile site. So the reason I say that is other sites could be worse. We know that, the nitrogen release from the soil was back 20, 25%, maybe 30%, right? So the sum of total nitrogen required to grow 13 or 14 tons of grass is about 450 kilos per hectare. If I just stick to round numbers, 200 has to come from the soil, 200 and 210, 220 has to come from fertilizer, another bit from slurry. That's the sum. So we have to understand that we're going to depend on other sources of nitrogen other than fertilizer going forward. And if they are compromised, which weather can do, or grazing conditions can do, or damaged soil can do, then they are, going to release less nitrogen. And that, as a result, then will result in less pasture production. We know the year was unfavorable for clover, and while some people would say it didn't work, I would say it underperformed. We know from quick estimates looking at the Clover 150 program that it produced about half the level or delivered about half the level of nitrogen it normally would in a normal growing year. So, with all those factors combined, difficult spring, damaged soil, uh, poor weather conditions, be it dry or cold, or damaged soil, call it what you want. Um, as a result, pasture production is back. And that's where the final result is. So when we look forward, then you have to learn, we have to make the most of the nitrogen sources that we have available to us, right? So very, very quickly, if you say about the soil, if P or K or lime are compromised, you're in trouble here. The soil will not deliver what it's supposed to deliver. It has a challenge to deliver when the weather conditions are poor as well, and we know that from previous work as well. And if you talk about fertilizer sources, then, if you just take a simple one of lime, if we're compromising pH, like no matter what fertilizer source you use for nitrogen, can, urea, protected urea, it doesn't make a difference. If the lime is wrong, or the pH is too low, there's nitrogen lost to the air, never to return, right? So that's a loss in the system. Then if we look at, other people say to you, well, God, the slurry worked well this year. Yes, and that's true. And if you look at what's happened over time, the amount of feed going into the cow that's not grass, I'm basically talking either silage or particularly meal, has doubled over the last 10, 12 years. So the slurry is now richer than it was before. So of course it's going to perform better. It's also in a form that was friendlier to plant when weather conditions are compromised. So that's not entirely surprising that slurry worked better or soil water worked better. We also have to understand that when you look at slurry and divide it in two, most of the P and K is in the solid fraction and most of the nitrogen is in the liquid fraction. And we have to understand that too to get the best out of it. So while 2024 was a very difficult year, there are things that we have to be aware of going forward. We don't have the flexibility in nitrogen fertilizer. We have to make better use of slurry. We have to make better use of soil water. We have to make better use of clover if we still want to grow 13 or 14 tons of dry matter per hectare on a regular basis. The sum show we can, but we have to get the best out of the system to achieve that. So it's not entirely surprising by your comment about the best farmers doing, still the highest levels of grass production, but we've performed poorer than normal, and there are two reasons for that. One is weather, and one is our fertilizer allowances of nitrogen are lower than before. So both are factors in this for me. Looking forward to 2025, you'd have to say, from Manny to putting a feed reserve in place, we're going to have to do the pieces we need to do on soil fertility. There are still major challenges there in terms of K and lime in particular, because there's no restrictions on those, right? I suppose the thing we learned from 2024, Stuart, would be reseeding. A lot of it got postponed because of shortage of grass, difficult weather conditions, and when you look at when the farm is struggling, what performs best? You see the reseeds perform better when the weather is, poor for grass growth. The reseeds still give a good bang for their buck. So, new grass, new pasture, that's going to have to be focused on in 2025 as well.
Yeah. So, John, coming back to what you mentioned, basically what Luke and maybe Elodie are kind of agreeing on in terms of changing in the future around climate and so forth.
Yes.
Elaborate a little bit more on the feed reserve. Like this feed reserve, thankfully, I suppose the way October, November came, we probably may have potentially gotten out of jail and might be speaking too soon because we don't know what's coming in the springtime. But talk to me about this feed reserve element.
Yeah.
Like, do people need to be very aware of this from the point of view of how many stock they're carrying and trying to generate that reserve and making the numbers fit, basically? They'll have to sit down and think about this.
Yeah, the first principle that those people that you talk about that we work with, because they've done a little bit more on it than us. Like, do you know, if you think about it, where we are in Europe, we are probably the best grass growing nation in Europe, and we're the last country left with a derogation. So, this risk in low nitrogen systems, we're not as used to it as, say, some of the Europeans. And the French people that we're talking about, their knowledge of soils and how they interact with different climatic conditions and different nutrient allowances, they're more experienced than us, I would say. But we can learn from them. And they will tell you the first thing that you have to know about lower nitrogen systems, right? And I mean all nitrogen, or lower fertilizer and nitrogen input systems, or moderate fertilizer input systems of nitrogen, is they bring greater risk, right? You don't have the
You don't have
flexibility
the
that you had in the
flexibility.
past.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when you bring greater risk, that means, what I mean by greater risk is lower levels of pasture production, right? And if you've lower levels of pasture production, feed must be found from somewhere, right? Or you carry less animals. It's either or, and maybe it's a bit of both. So the point that they make to us very, very quickly is you are now in a greater risk environment. And if you're in a greater risk environment, then you must have uh, systems in place to deal with that risk, right? And the first one would be a feed reserve, right? So we know that clover doesn't grow particularly well in the spring. We know our nitrogen allowances now, our fertilizer allowances are less. So therefore, there is a risk, if we're not careful, that we get compromises in grass production, particularly in the shoulders, if the weather is unfavorable. So they will say the first thing you've got to do is you've got to put a feed reserve in place. And I suppose, you know, look, 2024 was a difficult pasture production year. So we're probably back. The autumn has helped. It's one of the best autumns in years. I accept that, Stuart. We go into the spring probably in a better place than we thought we would be. But the first priority for many, many people next year will be to put a feed reserve in place. Now, you can't depend on hope. We all hope that 2025 is a better year in terms of pasture production or grass production. But at the same time, we have to look at our overall stocking rates. We have to look at where we are with fertilizer allowances, where we are with reseeding, where we are with soil fertility. And, it's a complete package. And I suppose to move on then, if there is too many animals on the farm and you can't generate enough feed, then you have to ask yourself the question, do we have too many animals? Can we grow more grass? Do we acquire more land? Those decisions have to be made. But fundamentally, we cannot keep going the way we have been for the last 2 or 3 years. Like, we learned from 18 that we had to put a feed reserve in place for the last 2 years for, all the weather reasons and other things we've outlined earlier. The feed reserve in most farms now is either very, very low or non-existent, and that has to be a priority for 2025. Yeah, for me, right? And you have to hear what they're saying. It has been said 2 years ago. It's been said last year. It's been said recently at the conference in September, Stuart, that you and I were at. So, you know, like, this has to be put in place. Now, there's different ways of doing it. I don't deny that, and everybody have their own approach. But, like, for many last April, the yards were bare, or the cupboard was bare. Imagine if you had 100 cows and had 100 bales spare, what that would have done for you last April. So we just have to learn from it, and react to it and put a plan in place to deal with it. You know,
And John,
if I go back to my colleagues, Stuart, that you and I work with, you go from the 1st of September to 1st of April. What will a cow consume? Roughly about 10 bales. Is that roughly it? So, 10 cows, 100 bales. You see where I'm going with this,
yeah, yeah, yeah. I suppose, John, the other thing is we were talking about this maybe last week or the week before as well. Like what you just outlined there, the 100 cow person that had nothing left in maybe mid-April, the impact that that actually had on milk production, it's probably only now that we've really started to see the real, well, like when you look back at maybe the year as a whole, 2024 versus maybe 2023 or whatever, that feed reserve issue is having a major impact in terms of
Oh,
the milk
completely.
supply of farms.
Yeah, when you start, like, people ask you and review the year, and you go back and look at their, I suppose the first place I'll go is Stuart's co-op performance report, see
Mm,
where the milk solids were for the months of April and May. Sure, they're all back, do you know.
yeah,
And when you start that discussion, yes, there was a weather piece, but then there was a piece. Well, I was kind of short of silage, so you know, and like whether we like it or not, like you know, grass growth, pasture growth, call it what you want, in February, March, and April was behind where it should be. The figures show that. But then some of that's only one piece. Then what's utilized is a different piece. So even though you may have had some level of grass, some of it got walked into the ground.
yeah,
So that gets lost. And you're depending on silage, and for many, they ran short of silage. For others, they had silage but had the wrong silage, if that makes sense. All the
mm,
good silage was gone. So, yeah, and throw the weather piece on top of it. Of course, the cows are going to underperform. And I suppose the figures show that for themselves. Well, unfortunately, while the back end came good, there was milk production lost in the first half of the year, without a shadow of a doubt. Yeah. The other problem
yeah.
with
So,
grass
John, I
being left
suppose,
behind was then you had pasture quality problems in the mid-season as well. That didn't go away either, and that
yeah,
left its mark too.
yeah, you'd an energy deficit as a result of having a lack of grass, coupled with low, we'll say poor quality silage, and then we ended up with a further energy deficit because the quality of the grass wasn't great, and it meant that we just never really peaked. I suppose, John, the roll on then from that basically is kind of what I'm reading between the lines here, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is basically you're suggesting that maybe people went out at stages in the spring of last year, maybe because their back was to the wall, they did that damage that you spoke about earlier, and as a result, then they actually impacted on the rest of the year further by doing that level of damage. So the role of, like, in terms of what people can be picking out of this and what they can maybe do in the short term, like grazing infrastructure. Okay, it's wait again at the moment now, but if you got some of the dry spells that we have had in the last couple of weeks, there is scope for doing bits of work around improving access. Doesn't even have to be a new roadway; it can be just even access points, which is a matter of just correcting or changing fence lines and stuff. How important is that to, like, deal with these shocks that you're talking about into the future? We'll say, are the challenges into the future?
Yeah, look, what happens when the weather is, if you get short spells of difficult weather, we can get around them. But if you get prolonged spells, the system comes under pressure. And, you know, so we all can go to the parts of the farm that are dry, have the right cover of grass, have the roadways in the right place, water trucks in the right place, loads of access. But when they get used up, then and you're saying, oh, should the weather will improve, and then you end up in the place where you don't want to be in the wet weather, and there is, inadequacies in terms of roadways, access, water truck. Although the water truck thing can be overcome now, I don't deny that. But that was highlighted, unfortunately, in a year in which unfortunately March was worse than February, and April wasn't much better. So everybody expected as the spring went on things got get better, but it didn't. So yeah, those things got shown up. The other thing is that we've learned over the years that where you're much more flexible with your grazing approach, in terms of making best of the difficult conditions, because you get your grazing management right, and your approach to dealing with weather right, and it requires flexibility. And you're also in a busy time of the year, and people get fatigued. So it's not easy. It's easy, fine for me to say all this is easier said than done in practice. But those inadequacies get shown up, I suppose. And you can still do maybe a reasonable job, even with difficult weather conditions, if you're set up well yourself, if the cows are set up well, if the farm is set up well, and the grass is set up well. And you need all four now to work with you when things get tough.
Like, is that like, if things are okay and you had a bit of time on your hands, you can put up the bits of temporary spurs and so forth like
You
that.
can, yeah. Now they
But
require
if
time and
they're,
work, but
yeah,
you have to be well organized to do that.
Yeah, but I
And
suppose is
you
your
have
is
you may need additional help, and it's fine for me to say all this, but they make a difference. That's the point, I suppose.
but it is your point that if you have those spurs in place already, it makes it an awful lot easier.
Oh, completely. So if I work in another program as well, which involves heavy soils, and like they'll say, without those things, they'll get a run of weather that's good and they'll manage, and then they'll get a run of weather that's not good, and without these things, life becomes very, very difficult. So to try and graze, and they know if the cows go indoors full time that there's a price to be paid in that too, and the data will show that on heavy farms. So, spending that extra bit of money on, and I would say these are, they don't cost an arm and a leg.
Mm.
They do take effort. I don't deny that, but the return on time and the return on investment is very favorable. So you get a quick return and you get a very good financial return by getting grass into the diet, especially if your back is to the wall. When you are running tight on silage, you have to make the best of the grass that's there. And sometimes, with the best effort in the world, things don't go according to plan, and you have to work with that. But if we end up walking a whole pile of grass into the ground because you're not set up right, or the cows are wrong, or what I mean by the cows are wrong is that they're not focused on grazing, then they can do a lot of damage in a very, very short period of time. So you have to have the four pieces right, Stuart, I suppose, in bad weather. The the grass has to be right, so it's never going to be the highest cover. The infrastructure or the grazing setup has to be right in terms of, square paddocks, not long and narrow, all those things, or allocations. The cows have to be right, and you yourself have to be right. Now that's a lot of getting right, but when it is done properly, it can give a good return to you. Yeah.
Yeah, and I suppose it's probably important to acknowledge, John, and I think we probably did see that this year. The lads on the heavy soils actually probably suffered least in a way
I think that's a fair comment, and they would agree with you. Yeah,
because they were used to it
correct.
and they were set up for it.
Well, they never bank on February anyway.
Yeah,
But they tend to be geared better and acclimatized to it better, and because of what they work with, they're more opportunistic, are a lot more flexible, and it's funny to say this, but the heavy soils guys didn't have the worst year in the world. No, Stuart, to be fair, despite a difficult spring now.
yeah, yeah,
But when things got going, then they weren't too bad, and they've had a good back end. Yeah, so that's a reasonable comment to say. Strange to say, but reasonable. Yeah, yes.
yeah. So I think it's really a case of people kind of trying to think back to the springtime and where were the pinch points or the challenges on their farm this year for them, and addressing those maybe in the next month to 6 weeks if they can get around to it. And as I said, like you said, it's not expensive. It might only be a box of handles. Could do an awful lot of
Yeah,
things
it's,
for
it's not it's
a
not
lot of
it's not
people.
a roadway, but an extra entrance or two, or approaching it differently.
Mm.
It requires a bit of planning, but to be honest, the reward is high now.
So John, you spoke about the soil fertility piece there already now, but so we'll make assumptions that people are going to go on and resolve that. The next step is slurry. Obviously, the deadline will be lifting there on the 12th of January for the counties in the south, and as we progress kind of gradually over the next couple of weeks, then it'll go on the 16th around the Limerick and up along that area, and obviously the end of the month then as we go further north. And then the chemical fertilizer piece or that opens up at the start of February now as well. So all that's been delayed a little bit. But like you would have been a big advocate of that early nitrogen and be that in the
Still
form of
am.
story. Still am, yeah.
Yeah,
And I suppose that's what I wanted to dig into. I suppose we have information that shows that early spread is important, but it's important that early spread takes place in the right conditions too, isn't it?
completely. Yeah. So the nitrogen in the spring, people think it's about fertilizer. It's not. It's about slurry as well, right? And like you have to understand what the slurry is doing for you, right? Now I accept we need weather to travel, all those things, but just it's just about being smart, right? So unfortunately, you and I know the fertilizer report and the P and K story is not good. not good at all, and it hasn't been good for the last few years. And people forget that if you want to get the best out of nitrogen, either from whatever source, clover, slurry, and particularly fertilizer, if the P and K is compromised, you will not get the response, irrespective of where the nitrogen comes from. So the slurry is a major source of P and K, right? And it's also a major source of nitrogen. And you have to understand that, as I said earlier, that the liquid fraction of slurry holds most of nitrogen and the solid fraction holds most of P and K. So everybody has their own different tanks in their yard. Some are very, very thick, some are a lot more watery. So it's about being smart. What doesn't make sense, especially given the restrictions on P and where we are with soil fertility, is spreading slurry of a thick content in the paddocks close to the yard that are already index 4. I don't want to beat around the bush here. It's fine for me to say, you must do this and that, right? And often, the paddocks around the yard are the easiest to get to for obvious reasons. But they're probably the wrong place to go with the best slurry, right? It's not good use of it. So we would hope that certainly a third, depends on grass growth now as well, I admit that, and it has been above average recently. But anyway, we're still a long way from the 1st of February or late January. So, the watery slurry should go to the paddocks that have the right cover that you can get to, that have good indexes, right? To be honest. And the thick slurry that has all the P and K in it should go to the paddocks or particularly the silage ground that requires it. So it's just about being smart with the slurry. We also know for the last number of years, with the way the springs have come, that the response to slurry nitrogen has been probably better than fertilizer. Not by much, but better. So it's a significant contributor to nitrogen sums in the spring and the nitrogen allowance in the spring. So we'd use it wisely. I suppose the second piece then is the fertilizer piece, which for most won't start till February, or for all, I suppose, the 1st of February, and for others a little bit later. But fine, it's having fertilizer in the yard, like looking for fertilizer in the end of January to spread in the 1st of February makes no sense to me. You have a big rush in it. You have day length working against you, logistical demands of trucks and all getting fertilizer into yards, and purchase is right, and people trying to get organized. So, like, the first thing should happen in January, Stuart, is that fertilizer's in the yard to go when you need it, not waiting or hoping that the lorry will come and deliver the fertilizer to you. So, there's a bit of planning here. There's a bit of planning required for the slurry. There's a bit of planning required for the fertilizer. The sum is fairly simple, Stuart, in assuming now, and we have a new government and three new ministers, right? So when I say three, I mean agriculture, the environment, and housing, and we can't, we have to keep that very much in mind. It's no longer one ministry; it's three, in terms of what we will be allowed in 2025. But just as a guide, right? You're talking about somewhere for those who have, the maximum allowance of fertilizer of, I'm going to guess, at 180 units, Stuart, right? So, you need to get, I would say, 70 to 80 units of nitrogen out on your grazing ground by the 1st of May, right? And, you know, if some of that comes from slurry, great. So I'm going to say 80, I'm going to say 10 comes from slurry. That leaves 70 units of nitrogen fertilizer spread between the 1st of February and the 1st of May. And that leaves then about 100 units for 120 days for, May, June, July, and August. Roughly. That's the rough numbers. You'll have slurry inside in that, you'll have soil water inside in that, you'll have clover inside in that. So what you're trying to do then, if you want to do it very, very quickly, you're trying to get some level of fertilizer out in February, some level of fertilizer in March, and some level of fertilizer in April. If I did quick sums in a short, you're trying to do somewhere about, I don't know, 20 units between fertilizer or slurry in February, something similar in March, and the rest in April to get to your target for the 1st of May. As a quick summary, 2,500 gallons will supply 16 to 20 units of nitrogen from a slurry source in February, right? 2,500 gallons. Okay. So,
Okay.
and not all the farm can get slurry, but some will, and then the rest then should get somewhere about the 20 unit mark um, nitrogen fertilizer, right? And that has to be in the urea form to be called a spade a spade. I'd be giving out for using the word units, but that's the language that farmers understand, right? I suppose I should use kilos per hectare, but anyway, for those who are in kilos per hectare, it's 100 kilos by the 1st of kilos of nitrogen by the 1st of May, if you want to convert it.
We missed that boat last year,
We did,
and
yes.
You could argue that
And,
they're
and
probably
probably
correct.
rightly so, given the weather
Yeah,
conditions. No? Yeah,
yeah. But
it's too
that
valuable.
yeah, that still sets up the year though. Obviously spread in the right conditions. I'll reiterate that point, and that's why we're agreeing that it was the right decision, maybe in some cases not to go last year because the ground was so wet, etc.
Well, sure,
But
you'd lose it. Like, it's too valuable. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But we need to catch up quick and deliver on that kind of target fairly quickly if the weather doesn't play ball with us. In order to try and that front loading is very important in terms of driving the season, isn't it?
Yeah, the pump has to be primed. I often use that term. Like,
Yeah.
like if what generally happens here is that the day length gets longer, and it's again about understanding where we're at now, and you have to understand it more than you did before. The day length gets longer, so the growth will pick up because day length gets longer, and eventually what happens is because of the winter and because of the soil's being cold, the plant requires nitrogen, and because the day lengths get longer, therefore the growth's getting therefore the growth is getting higher, therefore the plant requires nitrogen, and we know though in spring that with um, changeable weather conditions and the soil being cold, that the release of nitrogen from the soil is compromised. Like the nitrogen from the soil, I talked about 200 kilos earlier on, or 180 unit, or 160 units. Most of that comes in the latter half of the season. So, like if you had four sources of nitrogen in the farm, you could say the soil, the slurry, the clover, and the fertilizer. Two of those work well in the first half, right? Which are the slurry and the fertilizer. And the other two, the clover and the soil, are second half players. And you must get that balance and understand that right in your head to get the best out of it, right? You can't depend on the soil to deliver much in the spring. You can't depend on clover to deliver much in the spring. That's where the fertilizer and the slurry come in. And that's why, you'll hear people like you or me talk about getting fertilizer out in the spring, getting slurry out in the spring, because that's when the plant needs it most, mainly because the soil can't deliver as much, and the clover plant certainly can't deliver as much in the spring. They are second half players, right? So you have to get that balance right and understand that in your head. And that's why the bias is there to front load the fertilizer and front load the slurry in the spring. The first application is important, but I suppose the late March, April application is probably the most important of all.
So, John, I suppose we better wrap it up with that. You've covered a good few different points there. I suppose if I was to put you on the spot and tell you to pick three key areas that people need to focus on in order to drive things forward in 2025 and solve some of the problems that they may have in their own farms, what would those three things be?
Yeah, I suppose the first one anyway, without a shadow of a doubt, is feed reserve. We're running too tight a line for the last number of years. We're in a different environment now. As I said, the game has changed and the rules have changed. So you need a fertilizer, or sorry, a feed reserve, put in place because of that, right? And I suppose the next one then is to get the best response out of those sources of nutrient, which are slurry, fertilizer, the soil and clover, reseeding. A lot of it got postponed in 2024. So that's you refocus on that in 2025. It's also a way of getting clover into the farm that we're going to need going forward. I know people have reservations about it, and it had a difficult year, and it only produced half the nitrogen it normally did in 2024. But the reality is, going forward, we're going to need it as a source of nitrogen on the farm if you want to stay doing the tons of grass that we aim for, right? Which is somewhere, about 13 or 14 tons to be stocked at somewhere about 210 organic, I suppose. And the last piece is to get the best out of nitrogen fertilizer is, lime in particular and K, but therefore more for the second half of the year, I suppose, or when you might get a window in January or February for lime. I don't deny that. You might get a window if you cut for bales in the month of April or May. I suppose May in particular, but the K is more of a second half of the year. I admit that K will go out in the slurry, but that's a more I suppose a less sudden form of K. It's a more slow release form of K, which is fine. So K is really a second half season application. So those three things: put a feed reserve in place to refocus on reseeding, and the soil fertility piece. That's not going away. That's not going away.
The final sum up of it is they're actually back to basics, really, isn't it? It's
Oh,
like,
completely. But when you have a difficult environment um, that we've had and difficult weather conditions, some of those things got lost or missed or postponed or call it what you want. But we have to get back to that. We run the risk of trouble otherwise, you know.
so look, I wish yourself and the team in Grass 10 all the best for 2025. I hope it'll be a better year for ye as well, because obviously there's lots of headaches associated with the challenging years that we've had in the last few years from an advisory perspective, as well as from the farmers' perspective, obviously, and we empathise with farmers and the difficulty that they can be in at times. But if people just kind of think about where they're at, address the issues that they may have to deal with on their own farms, they could help alleviate some of the challenges. And obviously, then we're in the hands of the gods after that, then in terms of weather conditions. So, all the best for 2025, John, and thanks for joining me on the show today.
Yeah, I suppose, Stuart, I'll say that we hope for the best, but plan for the worst. It just takes a bit of planning, that you just get that in your own mind as to what way you want to approach this for 2025.
That's all for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast, and my thanks to John Maher for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify, and for more information go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. You can also email us at dairyedge.podcast@teagasc.ie. I'm Stuart Childs, and join us next time for your Dairy Edge.